There's something about the darkness at night that usually gets us right before we fall asleep. For the most part, we don't think of anything and we just fall asleep. But for some of us, paranoia takes over and we struggle throughout the entire night, fearing that there might be something in the darkness watching us. We close our eyes and pull our blankets over us, as if the blanket is a shield that can protect us from the ghosts. And even though we're sweating bullets under it, we get too afraid to uncover the blanket. Our hearts start to beat fast and breaths become heavy. We're too afraid to open our eyes, fearing we will see something when we open them. But we do anyways because curiosity gets the better of us. It was a hot night and I left my window open to get some kind of cool breeze in and fresh air. I rarely slept without a blanket, even on hot nights, because for some reason, I always felt more comfortable and more safe with the blanket on me. Next to my bed was my drawer where I kept my alarm clock, lamp, and usually a water bottle just in case I get thirsty throughout the night. And I was a night owl, always staying up late and not sleeping until early in the AM. I liked my lights off while I laid in bed on my phone, YouTubing or on Soompi or whatnot. I'm somewhat of a scaredy cat, and truth be told, I feared the devil's hour of 3 a.m. So around that time, I try to watch videos to keep my mind occupied. As I was watching a video on YouTube with my back facing the drawer, I heard something drop to the floor. Because it was wood flooring, the impact was loud enough for me to hear through my headphones. I looked down and saw that it was my water bottle. I thought that maybe my blanket or the wind had knocked it down. I picked it up, placing the half-empty bottle back onto the drawer. I went back to my previous position, and as I was doing so, a cool breeze blew in through the window, and again, something fell to the floor. This time, the sound was a lot flatter. Now afraid, I turned around and slowly looked at what had fallen. It was my water bottle again. This time, empty. The chills ran up my spine, throughout my whole body, immediately making my whole body cold and numb. There's something here, I thought to myself, scared to death. The window was still opened, and as much as I wanted it closed, I was too afraid to get up and move. So I threw myself under my blanket and made sure every part of my blanket was tucked in, even my feet. I felt safer because there were no open spots to the blanket. I closed my eyes and started to think of anything positive, anything that would put me at ease. It's all in my head, I repeated to myself. It's all in my head. Suddenly, while still under my blanket, I felt a light warm blow on my ear, sending a penetrating sensation up and down my body, as if someone was right next to me, under the blanket, whispering into my ear. My eyes shot open and I immediately removed my blanket and sat up. Right at the foot of my bed stood a dark figure. Her hair was dripping and her dress was baggy. Her body was swaying from left to right, and although I couldn't see, I felt her eyes looking right at me. Her presence was accompanied by a strange odor, one that was very unpleasant. I was too much in shock to be able to move to do anything. She turned and started walking around the bed frame towards my way. Her steps sounded wet and I could hear her raspy breathing. Slowly, she approached me. Her profile became clearer. Again, I threw my blanket over my head, now sweating like a pig. I was panting, running out of breaths. Should I stay still? Should I run out? Those were the thoughts running through my mind. But I sat still, unable to hear the footsteps coming my way anymore. After about 5 minutes, I peeked out of my blanket and was semi-relieved that it had gone away. Little did I know, when I removed the cover, she was sitting right on my drawer, looking right at me, grinning. Her teeth were rotten, her face wrinkly and old, and her hand only centimeters away from my face, looked ready to caress me. I screamed and, with adrenaline, jumped out of bed and ran out the door. I've never moved with such swiftness in my life before. I headed straight towards my parents' room and opened the door, literally flying onto their bed. By this time, I was crying. My mom heard the noise and asked me what was going on. I saw a ghost, I cried to her. I said no more, and my dad turned on the lights and went inside my room. Minutes later, he came back and told me to sleep with my mom and that he'll sleep in my room. The night suddenly became cold and uncomfortable, and traumatized I was. Now, I don't know if what I saw was really there or if it was a figment of my imagination. If it is real, who was the ghost and why did it appear to me? Our house had no haunted stories or experiences before, and I had always been fine in my room. What I saw felt so real, and I could just feel her presence with me that night. Was there a meaning to that? And if so, what was it? Or was it just a random encounter, a ghostly spirit that got lost on her way? There was a high school teacher whose class consisted of exactly 30 students. He was particularly strict and a little bit cruel to his students, making them stay back until late at night every day to study in the library. In order to make sure his students stayed back and didn't sleep, he asked them all to call his cell phone at certain times during the night and tell them their student number. This went on for a while, but all of a sudden, late one night, he received a call. He answered as usual, and a girl's weak voice replied, "Hi, teacher. I'm number 31. And then they abruptly hung up on him. At first, he didn't even realize, but then he felt furious as he thought one of his students was playing him for a fool. The next day, he stormed into the classroom and demanded a student who pulled the prank on him. No one did, and they all denied knowing anything about it. He threatened the whole class, telling them he would beat them all if it happened again that night. Unexpectedly, it did happen again, at the same exact time, to the second. He tried to ask the girl who was calling, but she hung up so quickly he couldn't get a word in. The next day, he lived up to his threats and beat the students in class, demanding that someone own up to it. Of course, no one did. He even went so far as to go to other classes and ask them about it, but no one would admit to anything. The calls continue on schedule every night the same way. Then, finally one night, he got his word in on time. "Who are you?" he questioned frantically. The girl replied softly, "I'm in your class, teacher. You know me." To which the teacher said, "My class only has 30 students. Stop trying to trick me." The girl only said this, "I'm always watching you during class, teacher, but you only show me your back. I want to see your face." Then she once again abruptly cut off the call. He told his students that they needed not stay back at all, even going as far to change his cell phone number. But the calls continued. The teacher eventually went crazy from the continuous and unexplainable calls and retired shortly afterwards. A few months after retiring, the school underwent renovations. While the builders were replacing the blackboard in the classroom of the old teacher, they were shocked to discover the dead body of a young girl. When my dad lived in Korea, he had a friend who had a house high up in the mountains. The area is known to be beautiful, a place that's fully covered with huge trees that block out a lot of sunlight. But during the night, this place gets pitch black, making it impossible to see anything unless you have a flashlight. Well, one day, my dad and his friend decided to go up the mountain during the daytime because they wanted to go swim near this waterhole, which was at the beginning of a long river that flowed down the mountain. My dad and his friend played there throughout the day until night and decided to go back because it was getting dark. So they packed their things and started to make their way home. On the way back, my dad and his friend decided to have a race to see who could make it back to the house first. They burst off and went their different paths. And then my father got lost. He wandered around for a few hours and it became pitch black. He couldn't see anything in sight. After a few more minutes of wandering around, he heard someone calling out his name. It sounded like his friend's sister. He thought that she had come out looking for him, so he ran towards the sound of the voice. To his surprise, it was my friend's sister, but her back was turned to my father. When my dad reached for her shoulder, she bolted off running, and my dad naturally ran after her. She was extremely fast and very abnormal. It seemed like her knees were bending outwards while she was running and her arms were flailing up and down. After a long chase, she suddenly came to a stop and my dad bumped into her because of his momentum, but she didn't move. He called out her name and she turned around. It was the face of his friend's sister, but it was horribly twisted. Her eyes were round and pitch black. She had her mouth wide open. She had sharp teeth and her skin was extremely pale. My father couldn't believe what he saw, and he was stuck there frozen solid. Then this thing that looked like his friend's sister began approaching my dad, limping left to right, with a smile on its face. He let out a scream and this thing began mocking him, laughing and screaming back. This thing was approaching him and he couldn't move. It seemed like he was out of luck until he heard a familiar voice calling out for him. This time it was his friend's sister. She came out from the woods with a flashlight and pointed it at my dad. He was in so much shock that he couldn't even speak. His sister's friend began to yell at my dad, but he didn't even respond to her. He looked back to where this thing was, but it was gone. She then knew something horrible must have happened to him. They went back to the house and my dad told them what happened and what he had seen. There really isn't an explanation to why such a thing like this exists in that area, but they say that many people have gone missing in a similar fashion to what my father experienced. It was 10 years ago that I was still a little kid at the age of 8 or so. We lived in a house that I used to think was peaceful until I started to realize that strange things were happening around the house. I still remember there were times that knockings happened unexplainably and there were always a lot of cats in our backyard. Not just a few, but many. I slept in the same room with my parents and sisters, and my dad is someone that cannot fall asleep if there's any noise. Even if I just move around my left to my right, he would immediately tell us to not move too much so he could fall asleep. But ever since these cats appeared, my father stopped telling us to not move. Instead, he's busy setting traps to scare the cats away so they won't bother his sleep. These traps work for a couple of nights, but not forever. My dad soon started to notice that these cats weren't afraid of the traps set outside the window anymore, but there's nothing he could do. One night, when we were all asleep, my grandma couldn't sleep in the room, so she slept in the living room on the couch. All of a sudden, she heard a loud bang, bang, bang outside of our front door. It was so loud that it woke her up immediately. My parents weren't home at that time because they were on their way to the farmer's market in San Jose. My grandma went to open the door and there was nothing. Right then, she noticed something was not going right. She went back to sleep and pretended like nothing happened. A few minutes later, another loud bang, bang, bang happened on the door. There was a small room on the side that had a window and you could see our front door. My grandmother stood up, looked out the window, and the door was still knocking. But strangely, there was nothing there at all. My grandma was so scared that she ran to her room and woke my grandpa up. She told him to open the door and see what it was, but my grandpa just wouldn't. He said it was nothing and for her to go back to bed. Strangely enough, my grandma was the only person that heard these loud bangs. No one else heard them. A couple of days later, when my dad heard the story, he believed it. He then called for the owner of the house and asked for a history of the house. He found out that a lady died at the front of our door. I'm not sure how she died, but that's where it took place. My dad said that that was probably the reason why she kept knocking on the door, wanting to come home. A few weeks later, we did a blessing and moved out of the house as soon as we could to get away from all the cats in our backyard and the unexplainable knockings. My oldest brother once told us a story about when they were living in Thailand before my parents and they all moved to the US. Anywho, he was telling us that our great-grandmother was really ill to the point where she couldn't walk anymore. Every day, she would just lay in her bed and mumble to herself. Things she talked about never made sense. She had to be fed and cleaned, and she wasn't capable of doing anything at all on her own. Everyone knew she was slowly passing away. A couple of weeks before her death, she had begun to get possessed. During the day, she was doing what she regularly did, just laying in bed because she wasn't capable of getting up. However, at night, she got up by herself and jumped on chairs and jumped around with her eyes wide open and tongue sticking out. She would do that until the sun was about to rise, then she'd go back to bed and she would lay there helplessly until nighttime came again. When she passed away, the odor was excruciating. People were saying they didn't know why her body gave such an odor compared to other funerals that they had been to. Once the sun set, my family was still at the funeral taking care of other things. At around 3 or 4 in the morning, my dead grandmother got up and let out a scream and tried to take off the Hmong clothes she was clothed in while her eyes rolled back and she had the biggest grin on her face. One of the older men said some words and she laid back down regularly. You could say it woke everyone up and everyone wanted to leave immediately, but they stayed for the sake of the family. When it came time to bury her, it rained like crazy. They had a hard time because one of her shoes went missing. After looking everywhere, it was under one of the beds of my uncles. After the burial, my brother ended up bunking together with my uncle in his bed, the same bed where the shoe was found under. And he said that the whole night, he and the uncle heard mumbling under the bed like what my grandmother used to do. When my dad was a child, he witnessed this event with his own 2 eyes. Back in Laos, in a village, there lived a mixture of Hmong and Lao people who lived near each other. One night, one of the Lao people dreamt that a dragon was going to come and get a cow. The cow represents a Hmong person, and the buffalo represents a Lao person. The Lao people already knew that someone was going to die. That following morning, 3 sisters went swimming in the river by their village. They were all swimming and holding hands in the water together. Suddenly, one of the sisters said that something was pulling her. The other 2 sisters were trying to help her, but then it seemed like they were going to be pulled down with her. They got scared and let go of her hand. The girl swiftly disappeared into the river. The villagers came out to see what the commotion was all about. They saw the girl flailing around in the water and said that there was a hand popping out of the river doing a bow to heaven. My father said that when the dragon is going to come get a human, they would beg the heaven first, so therefore those hands belonged to a dragon. A couple of days later, they found the body of the girl and brought her body back to the village. The Lao people checked the teeth of the girl and knew right away that it wasn't the girl's real body. The 2 teeth in the girl's mouth weren't there. My father told me that dragons can transform into humans, but they can't make the 2 front teeth to be like humans. The Lao people asked if the Hmong people wanted to cut off the head of the dragon. However, if they want to cut off the head, they'll have to cut the girl's feet. It is known that when a dragon is in a human's form, their head is the feet and the feet is the head. The parents of the girl loved her so much that they just couldn't bear to see them cut off the girl's feet, so in the end, they just buried her. I asked my dad what would happen if heaven didn't let the dragon take the girl, but my dad told me that the dragon probably made a deal with heaven before even taking the girl. Here's a story that I remember back when I was a little kid. I was too young, so I don't know if it's a true story or not. There was this daughter who lived with her mother. She was mean to her mom and didn't help her out at all, and always took advantage of her. The daughter would always curse at the mother, and the mother told her daughter that since she was so mean to her, when she's dead, the daughter is going to have to carry her corpse back to the grave. Eventually, the mother did pass away, and no matter how many people carried her or tried to use some sort of force to remove her, she would not budge an inch. Finally, they checked to see what was wrong, and they saw that the mother was angry at her daughter for being so mean to her for her entire life, so she wanted her daughter to carry her on her back to the grave. As the daughter carried her, she finally got to the grave and tried putting her mother down, but the corpse would not get off at all. So again, no matter how many people tried to remove the dead mother off the daughter's back, it did not work. They eventually tried to cut the mother's skin, which was glued to the daughter, but that would only hurt the daughter instead. Finally, they gave up and the daughter was buried with her dead mother. My dad shared this story a long time ago. I actually overheard him telling my uncle. He usually would not tell me something like this, especially when we were kids, because he never wanted to scare us. He had friends in another state who loved to hunt. Every year, they all looked forward to hunting season. When that time of the year rolled around, it became an event for all of the hunting buddies. There were several of them, and every year they went out together and used at least a couple of weeks of vacation time just on hunting. One of the men was a former military officer. I believe he was a colonel during the war back in Laos and a good friend of my dad's. He was always the most enthusiastic one when it came to hunting because it took him back to his teenage days wandering the jungles of Laos and hunting for game. Sadly, 1 year before hunting season came around, he got really sick. The illness was very sudden and potent. I don't remember what his illness was, but within weeks of being diagnosed, the colonel passed away. A few months later, when hunting season came around, the hunting friends planned as they had done so every year for the upcoming season. When the big opening day came, the men went out early and did what they always did, even though one of their own was no longer with them. As the men spread out and went to their designated spots, there was uneasiness. Several of them experienced strange things. They heard voices calling to them. They heard moans and groans mingled with the sound of the wind. They heard footsteps rustling the fallen leaves only to see that there was no one else around. They would even see strange shadows that would vanish quickly as they saw them. As the hunting season went on, the men began to talk. It turned out that it was just not one or two men seeing and hearing these strange things, but almost all of them experienced something. Finally, one day, one of the men saw him. This man had been in a tree stand waiting for deer. Nothing resembling a deer came near his tree stand all morning. By noon, he was hungry and decided to make way for camp. As he was walking, he felt uneasy, like someone was watching him. Then, as he came up upon a large tree, there he was, the colonel. As the man walked around the tree, he saw his friend, the colonel, the one who passed away, just standing there, wearing his hunting clothes with a blank look on his face. He didn't look particularly scary. It just looked like a snapshot of a picture or something. The man stumbled backwards in shock. He blinked and, just like that, the colonel was gone. Quickly, that man made his way back to camp. When the others arrived, he told them what he had just witnessed. If it was anything else, the other men would have probably joked and made fun of him, but because of the strange occurrences and their beliefs, his friends took him very seriously. They packed up and left right away. Of course, a shaman was called. The shaman blessed the man who saw the colonel. The shaman said that the colonel meant no harm. It's just that hunting was his favorite thing to do in the entire world, and he was really looking forward to hunting season, but was sad that he did not make it. The shaman told the men that they could go hunting again, but this time to offer the colonel a food offering before going out to hunt, so he would not scare them. Back in Thailand, there was a town that contained about 10 to 15 families, and all the families had a lot of children. All the kids knew each other and shared a close bond. They would play every day from sunrise to sunset while their parents farmed. Late one evening, the group of children were playing outside when they suddenly heard the village dogs barking at the forest. The forest was quite close to their village, so all the kids were frightened and went home. As for the dogs, they continued to bark throughout the night. The next day, the children came outside to play again, as if nothing happened the night before. They played until evening came again. The dogs started to bark hysterically. Some of the kids needed to go home early that evening for supper, but the other kids decided that they wanted to play longer. So that group of kids, ranging from the ages of 6 to 12, planned to meet outside the village to play hide and seek. After supper, the dogs quieted down from barking and all the kids met up at the spot that they planned. They played up until it was pretty close to midnight. Then they decided to play one last game of hide and seek before heading on home. When they were about to begin, the dogs started to bark again. All of the children were scared at this point. They partnered up with a partner. One of the boys was so excited that he grabbed a random partner and took off hiding. After everyone was found, except for the young boy, they went searching for him but could not find him. They thought that he probably went home since he always cheats and goes home first. The next morning, the boy's parents went looking for him. They asked all the kids, but no one ever saw him again ever since that night. One of the girls said that when they had started the hide-and-seek game, she saw him climbing on the girl's back and remembered seeing her back had fuzzy hair. 4 months later, the parents could not find him, and he hadn't returned home. They decided to see a shaman. The shaman said that when they were playing, the boy accidentally grabbed a ghost to be his partner, but he didn't know. The ghost told him to climb onto her back so she could take him to a good hiding spot. The boy was never found. I once dated a ghost girl during my younger adult years. At the time of our meeting, I would have never thought that she was a bunzong. I lived in a mid-sized, growing metropolitan city in Wisconsin. I will share my first encounter. I remember it like it was yesterday when I first met Mai. It was a nice, sunny, beautiful day in September. The leaves were starting to fade. You could feel the warmth in the summer breeze cooling to a slight chill, signifying the beginning of fall. The annual Hmong Labor Day tournament was being held on that weekend. Back then, teenagers and young adults flocked to the river area near the landing docks to meet and greet. As I was trying to get my game on, I saw Mai walk past me at the corner of my eye. With the blink of an eye, she was gone. I noticed that she had the most beautiful, shiny black hair. It was long and free-flowing. For some reason or another, I followed my instincts and went to this isolated part of the park near the river's edge. There she was, sitting on a big rock with her back turned towards me. I went up to her and asked, "Hello, miss. What's your name?" When she replied, her voice sounded like the most beautiful music to my ears. Time stopped. I asked her what she was doing all by herself. She said that she was waiting. I asked if I could wait there with her and get to know her a little bit. We spoke, and by the time I noticed, it was dark. I offered to take her home. I drove her home and she gave me the general area. I felt this chill in the air during the drive. The hair on the back of my neck stood up straight, but I ignored it. Mai told me to drop her off a few blocks away. She didn't want her parents to see her being dropped off. I drove off, trying to figure my way back to the main road. I passed a cemetery and thought to myself, that's gotta be kind of freaky living near a cemetery. The next day, I went back to the tournament. My friends asked me where I went the day earlier. I told them I met Mai and was talking to her. They told me that they'd been looking for me all day. They called my cell phone many times, but only my voicemail picked up each time. I had my phone on me the whole day. I generally get good service. I told them to forget about it and that they already found me. As we were walking back to the hangout spot, my phone rang. It was that familiar voice that I had fallen in love with the day earlier on the other end of the line. I got done talking and looked at my friends. They had the most surprised look on their faces, the kind of look you get when something is so out of the ordinary happens. Their jaws dropped. I asked why they were giving me that look. I was told that my phone never rang and that I was talking to myself.